Just a few seats, yeah. T minus 1 minute. Good morning, Ricardo. I can do it. Yeah. Excellent. Would you like to switch off every so often? Okay. Cool. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. How's that, remote people? Ah, good. Thank you. All right, and thank you, Lorenzo, for taking care of that. Are we ready to roll? Sufficient people who are present and at least marginally awake? Welcome to the first in-person session of DKIM. So, it's Friday. You should have noted well, but we will make sure you note well yet again. Remember that by participating in an IETF activity, of which this is one, you are agreeing to all of our policies and procedures. These include things about standards of behavior, about intellectual property, about copyrights and patents, and the general standards process. So please make yourself aware of all of those BCP documents. If you have questions, you may come ask the chairs. And if you have concerns about intellectual property, you probably want to step out of the room and read those things before you step back in. Note really well some explicit reminders that our meetings follow the anti-harassment guidelines and the code of conduct. Please conduct yourselves reasonably. If you have any concerns about these things, if people are misbehaving in the room, feel free to approach chair. And if you feel like maybe something has crossed the line into actual harassment, please feel free to contact one of the Ombuds team members, of which I happen to be one. But you can pick somebody else if you like. Please make sure you're signed in. The QR codes are on the microphones and by the back of the room. And for remote folks, please make sure to, like the people here, use the little tool to ask to be in the queue, and then when we recognize you, go ahead and just turn on your audio and or video. Well, do the audio, I don't care about the video. And if you do have a headset at home, that can improve echo cancellation for certain environments. And here is our usual, here's where to find the agenda and all the other fun stuff. Here's the agenda for today. We're going to do 15 minutes of just chatting about administrivia, purpose of the working group, how we're going to conduct discussions, etc. A little talk about what's in the charter. Then Bron has decided to lump all of his little bits about presenting the proposed incoming documents that were mentioned in the charter into one presentation. So we'll put little breaks as we go along for Q&A. And then we'll have some time for all other business if people want to talk about other business. Any agenda bashes in this regard? Anything that we need to explicitly add? Should be nice and general. So let's talk about the room. You want to start? Sure.
I put together some points inspired by a couple of other working groups that are starting about how we look at the way we want to run this working group and how it may or may not be different from how DKIM has iterated in the past. So this is more a discussion, a starting point, like if we want to see something different, but this is what we're planning to do. We will be a little stricter than usual on the code of conduct. I think that we've seen already that sometimes discussions in this, not only in DKIM, but in the email space can get a little bit contentious kind of quickly. And that can be a massive distraction as we've seen. So we intend to be a little bit, I don't know, trigger happy on making sure that those things are addressed as quickly as possible so that they don't drag us down into what just happened in DMARC over the last 10 years. Next, please. Interrupt me with questions if anybody has objections or wants to talk about any of this stuff. We will consider it critical that whatever we roll out here does not smash the deployed base. It's one thing to plan to do a turn up whatever this group produces and turn down the other thing in an ordered manner, but we don't want to see suddenly large parts of the infrastructure stop working because of what we're doing here. Next, please. As we've seen from the conversation on the list so far, we are in the assumption that we're planning to do something new that isn't DKIM. If it turns out that it's possible to do with increments to DKIM and satisfy all of our requirements that way, then we should do that. But we are under the assumption that what will come out of here is something different. And there's been also some debate that if it's a different thing, we need to call it something different. That's absolutely true. We can figure out the name later. For now, we are still called this. Hey, Barry.
This is Barry Leba. Can you just take the previous slide in this and
Sure.
tell me how they go together?
Oh, go ahead.
So the slide about compatibility is really the email system may not come crashing to the ground because of whatever we do here. If we want to do interoperability with old things, that's all great. But the way things are running needs to continue on until said time as everybody moves over to new thing if they so decide to do it. The assumption that it is a new thing is about starting points for the work in this working group, right? We've got a set of documents that showed up in the charter as our input documents that are saying we're going to start afresh with some new mechanisms, maybe reusing some of the underlying bits of DKIM, but that it's going to be a new protocol of some sort. We're going to go on that assumption until there is movement otherwise that says, no, we can reuse old bits. So they are two independent kinds of things.
I also think that we should be very careful not to do something as a result of this that further damages mailing lists, for example. That's not just compatibility with DKIM as it is today, but other pieces of the mail ecosystem should not be damaged. Right. Jim.
Just sort of a question along these lines. If we have two approaches to the problem, one of which is backwards compatible with DKIM and one which is not, but may have some other optimizations or something like that, how do we decide between those? Do we consider compatibility with existing DKIM to be important, or are we really looking to try and optimize for the current set of problems?
So at one level, the answer is that's an engineering decision that the group's going to have to make. However, we were chartered to solve a certain set of problems. There are a list of problems in there. Mm-hmm. So if we want to, say, use some method that is more interestingly backwards compatible or more interestingly an easier upgrade, but that doesn't solve certain problems that are in the charter, that's probably going to have to be a discussion that says, well, are we updating a bullet in the charter that we think we can make optional? Or so I think it's still a discussion to be had, but we're going to refer back to the charter on questions of, which thing, if that's the only thing dividing the two. Otherwise, it's an engineering decision for the group.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Ron?
I was going to put myself in to answer that with it depends which one has more interest in implementing it to a large degree. Whatever we come up with here, if it doesn't get implemented, it doesn't matter how good it is. So it also depends who will implement it and what the pathway is from what we have now to that safely.
And that is also a point that's in the charter, that deployability is one of the key features.
In my personal view, at least, one of the reasons DMARC has struggled over the years is that it has serious collateral damage to lists, and we never really invited that community or insisted on that community being present in the room. And so if we're going to tread on such territory again this time, I'd really like us to make a concerted effort to have them in the room and be part of the conversation rather than try to rope them in later like, oh, did we accidentally step on you? I think that we should be much more proactive. We want to make sure everyone agrees that the input documents that we select are the property is the wrong word, I'm sorry. The working group is developing something based on an input document and is not required to keep that input document pristine. I hope we all agree that that's the case here. We're not just sort of stamping something that's fully developed. We will consider something that is usable by both large and small operators to be preferred. As in, you know, I should be able to do an open source implementation of something on my single machine and it will work just as well as if Google built it. I guess that's kind of a statement on how the code I write, isn't it? Okay, next. The email core space is out of bounds. We will not be changing SMTP. We can register new header fields. We can't change what a header field is. Nothing drastic like that. We get a lot of suggestions in this space. This was the reason MailMate was chartered. We get a lot of sort of peripheral things or adjacent things that we were asked to work on. Those can become distractions very quickly. We will attempt to either disallow or dispatch those things to other places where they can be properly processed. If it's not germane to the charter, then to solving a problem that's in the charter, then we will resist it. Okay, so any questions on any of that? I don't see anybody else queuing or. I wanted to go over really quickly what the charter says, so we're all reminded of what we're attempting to do here. These are the four bullets that describe the issues that we are attempting to. This is straight out of the charter, except for the bold facing. There should be no surprises here. We want to find a way to maintain validation of a signature across certain forwarding and modifications. We have a proposed method for doing that. We want to solve the DKIM replay problem somehow. Backscatter is a concern so that the proponents are seeking to tackle, and better visibility into resulting errors. Is there anything else that anybody believes should be in the core set of targets for this working group? Charting would have been a good time to bring that up, but let's talk about it here once more. Jim.
Yeah, Jim Fenton again. In terms of the first bullet there, the maintain validation, one of the things that I don't see discussed there is potential for abuse-resistant methods of maintaining validation. I mean, you can look at the existing DKIM L equals, length parameter as essentially an attempt to maintain validation across appending to a message. And that's been, widely panned as being much too subject to abuse. I think the effort here needs to both address maintaining validation, but also doing it in a way that is resistant to that.
Yeah, I believe we read into that requirement exactly that point, and it's good to be explicit about it.
I guess you're saying the same thing I was about to say, which was, we all know what we meant when we wrote this. But if we have to fix it because we start straying into the area you're talking about, we can tighten the wording up.
And it does go back to sort of that general engineering principle about a reasonable objection to something introduced is that's going to produce a crap engineering output. So yes, but good to be reminded of
And the goals that we stated in the charter matching those, I think we have a pretty good alignment here, is to provide assurances against unauthorized use, which is the, I think that's the response to replay. Identifying message mutations, which is the preservation of a signature across modification again. Mitigation of backscatter, this third bullet, I think also includes the fourth point, which was better reporting out of the resulting signature stream. Does anybody disagree with this? Did we miss anything? Kiro.
One of the things I think actually is missing here in the whole is that what I see the scary thing about DKIM2 is it's going to cause fragmentation of the email infrastructure. We have these people who are doing DKIM2 and they say, oh, sorry, you are not doing DKIM2, we are not receiving any email from you. That's our opinion, we can do that. And then there is the rest of the email infrastructure who is sending emails with or without DKIM2 and they can't actually talk to the other people. And this happened in DMARC in some cases, because some people are saying, oh, if you don't have a DMARC record, if you don't have a SPF record, if you don't have a DKIM, no entry. And this is actually very bad. And I think one of our goals should be that we should try to prevent this kind of fragmentation.
Mm-hmm. And one of my reactions, and Bron,
And I had no idea how to do it.
yeah, one of my reactions is, that ship may have already sailed. I would certainly say that if things we come up with decrease fragmentation, that would probably be good, and would be taken in as a reasonable engineering consideration. But yeah, I don't know that in protocol terms how much we can really affect that. Bron, you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say pretty much that. Sending email to some degree is a privilege. As a receiver, you have a right to decide what you want to accept and what you don't want to accept. It's already the case that if you don't do SPF, don't do DKIM, you're going to find deliverability is less. And this is if you don't contribute to fixing the problems, then your email might be received, but I think it's okay for sites to say you've had a chance. This has been out here for some number of years. If you don't want to upgrade to software that supports this out of the box or write your own support for it, you're not going to get as good deliverability, and that's okay. We can't focus on those cases at the expense of the problems that we see forever.
So what are the point? Actually, what I was saying, I would still like to have it as a goal to reduce fragmentation. And for end user, not talking about people who are sending thousands of emails, not somebody who is actually maintaining. The end user having delivery problems means that email is not reliable. You have to use phone, which is annoying. But I mean that's one of the problems. Is I don't care about if the mass marketing stuff goes through. I actually would remove all of it. I actually would be very happy if all that kind of things, I could just fragment it away and say, never ever send anything like that to me. But I really care about emails that I get my friends who happen to update his own mail server or does something this and that kind of things.
John, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try not to be too redundant. Yeah, I have more sympathy with Bron's point of view. I mean, I run my own mail server, and okay, I added a DKIM signer, and it was a minor pain, but I did it. And I don't think this is as an explicit thing, but I see it as implicit, which is there's a certain amount of negotiation with the parties involved. For example, for managing modifications, I don't think it's likely that we can possibly describe every possible modification in a useful way. On the other hand, I do think it is possible we describe the modifications that mailing lists are likely to make. And I also think it would be useful for us to negotiate with, talk to the people who do the mailing list, say these changes are easy to describe, these are harder. How hard would it be to update your list software so it modified stuff in ways that we can describe and would your users care? Because I think there's a lot of cases well, gee, we don't care. Let's do that. But I don't know whether it's worth making that explicit or just sort of keep in mind that we need to have somebody talking to the mailman and somebody talking to Sampa. I mean, I'm talking to Sampa, we can't find mailman.
Much as I would enjoy making Murray run down to the floor mic, I'll recognize Murray, the participant.
I'm not sure if this is hatless or not, but I'll just ask the question anyway. The conversation is interesting. Does anybody in particular feel like we need to tweak the charter to say this stuff about we will or will avoid fragmentation, what have you, or is it okay the way it is, at least to get going? Like, if this is something that we really want to deal with as a goal or a non-goal, then now's the time to deal with it. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Seeing nobody diving to the mic, I'm going to assume that means we're okay proceeding as is with the conversation on the record, I guess. Okay. A reminder of all the constraints that we're under. Incremental enhancements to DKIM are preferred but not required. This was part of the charter conversation to at least evaluate whether it's possible to do this. We can't just go skip to a new thing without at least considering this. We will prefer something that is incremental to the deployed ecosystem. This is again a repeat that, like, please don't be disruptive. This should be able to add on. This should be able to exist on top of the existing basic infrastructure. The working group should document support for its decisions. I would really like us not to ship this and then be asked after it's published, why did we do it this way? Why did we do it that way? Take a couple of sentences and explain, we went this path because we considered this other option and discarded it because. I think that's going to be valuable for the record in the long term. And robust solutions are expected. I think that we tend to entertain ideas that work in corner cases, and we do that a little bit too much. Jim.
One question on this slide. You mentioned DMARC there, and I haven't seen anything discussed for DKIM 2 that would be a policy mechanism, right? So I kind of think of DMARC as being in a different category. It's like one level up from authentication.
I think the reason it's there is we can certainly imagine that people would want to publish policy about DKIM 2 in similar ways that they publish policy about DKIM and SPF and anything else. But I agree with you, it's not core to what we're doing, but I'm thinking that there's going to be some interaction.
Okay, but a policy mechanism is not part of DKIM 2, at least by the charter currently, right?
Not my read of the charter that we are meant to come up with such a thing.
Good, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Todd was there. Todd, go ahead.
Well, regarding DMARC, correct me if I'm wrong, but where we are, at least in the initial design of DKIM 2, is a place where if a message doesn't validate, it's rejected, correct?
Oh, I didn't write it. For people familiar with DKIM, for the proposed solutions, does anybody want to comment on that?
Go ahead, Jim.
Jim again. I did see something in the comments that I sent last night about the problem statement document. I did see some implications there that seem to be along the lines that if a message didn't validate, that it would be rejected. So it didn't say that explicitly, but I kind of got that flavor from it.
Richard.
The intent of DKIM 2 is that if the message does not validate, it is local policy as to whether or not you accept it, because you have no particular reason for believing that the purported author of it has in fact ever seen the message at all. If it fails validation, turning it down may well be an optimal thing for you to do, but it's your server, you can do what you want. I think where this wanders into the DMARC space is that, don't forget, DMARC has two aspects to it, one of which is a policy statement, and the other part of which is a reporting aspect. And some of the reporting which is done in DMARC may be of less interest to you when you get the sort of reporting that you get from DKIM 2 as an alternative. However, it is not the intent of DKIM2 to make DMARC at all. It wasn't a design aim that we would sweep up DMARC as well. We're really trying to kill off things like ARC and grey listing and all sorts of other exotica which people have tried to put in place in order to fix problems, and a cleaner and more global view of the problem seemed to us to be a more sensible thing to do.
Go ahead, Todd.
I hear what Richard's saying, but if we move to a model where the receiver decides to reject the message because it didn't validate, that's 180 degrees reversed from a model that DMARC provides with this policy statement of, please, if this message doesn't validate, treat it this way. Yeah, it goes from a request on the part of the domain owner to a decision on the part of the receiver. And so I'm not bullish on DMARC having a very large role in a world where DKIM2, as currently thought about, is widely deployed, but that'll be a long time away. So we'll see.
We'll finish with Richard again.
Go ahead, Richard.
As you're doubtless aware, quite a number of mailbox providers have made the position clear that they do not believe that mail which does not validate is going to be accepted. The Yahoogle, if you like, of this world, and there's quite a lot of very large mailbox providers who have joined that group and taken that policy view. But as I said before, it's your server. You can make up your own mind what to do with a message, whether it validates or not.
Yeah, let's keep going. So a reminder of the 3 deliverables that are chartered. We have an overview document that will be informational that describes the problem area and the general description of the proposed solution. One or more technical documents that actually lay out the mechanism. These 2 will be standards track, and an applicability statement also on the standards track that guides use during any kind of deployment period that we decide that we want. It may bring up to achieve this capability, you use DKIM2 this way. If you have other interests, do it that way. Whatever guidance we can provide will go in the 3rd one. That's all we're expecting to produce. We did leave a provision in there that we can iterate at experimental until we think it's ready for the standards track if we want to, which I realize makes more work for Andy, but that's why we pay him big bucks. And that's all we had for chair stuff. Are there questions, or can Braun proceed? All right. Oh, there's one.
All right, thank you. What we've got, sure, why not? Let's click away. I think you just share it to the clicker, which is at the top of your list. At the top of the participants, there should be a virtual person, which is this little thing.
That guy is right there.
This guy. Pass slide control. Hey. All right, I have slide control, maybe. So these are the 3 drafts that are currently in the data tracker that actually have material. My slides are somewhat repetitive of what you said in the chair slides, so I'll skip through that bit fairly quickly. The 3 people named at the bottom of here are the 3 authors on various of these slides so far. We also have other documents that will hopefully arrive at some point with Alan, who's also present remotely today. Speaking about the bounce handling, which is something I haven't gone into great detail here, but we certainly need to look at in more detail. All right. So motivation for bringing this work in the first place was that the DKIM replay group didn't get buy-in, and it didn't get buy-in because it didn't solve enough problems. The reason we've proposed this work is that it solves enough problems that we think it will be worthwhile. So it grew out of, at my very second ever IETF, I was at a hackathon and I implemented ARC. And upon implementing ARC, I realized it had holes in it. And those holes have led to ARC not getting widespread adoption because people are not seeing the benefits of it because those holes exist there. We also did some work for DKIM Replay. This group grew out of conversations at Morg a year and a bit ago. People realized that we needed to solve enough problems to make this worthwhile, both to do the work and for people to modify their mail systems to support it, socialize this idea amongst some of the bigger players in both sending, receiving, and the middleware boxes, the kinds of things that modify emails along the way. We haven't, as the chair said, spent a lot of time with people doing mailing lists other than Rick, who runs a mailing list software at Fastmail. So we have some experience with it, but it would be good to bring in more of the high volume mailing list managers as well. There's lots of engineers keen to test this stuff. I think once we get moving here, we should see quite a lot of motion this year on trying things out once we've specified it enough that we can interoperate. We don't believe that those drafts, as currently published, are complete or necessarily exactly the approach people will take. There's room to adjust just about anything in there, making sure that, as we said, it works the right way. All right, goals. Obviously, eliminating the replay of messages. That's about a year ago, it became a big problem. The big providers have mostly sorted around it, but they're doing it with heuristics, and there's certainly edge cases both ways there. If you can send a message to arbitrary numbers of people as if they were BCC'd on it, you've got problems. Delivery status notifications, safe, that's the backscatter issue. We need to make sure that that one's solved. And that one I believe we can completely solve with a little bit of basically what DKIM already does, signing things and making sure that you don't bounce unless you have, you don't accept and then bounce unless you have a signed thing. Making privacy preserving forwarders safe is something that falls out of safe delivery status notifications. At the moment, the only way to safely reject something is to reject it at this SMTP stage. So the sending server is then responsible for generating the bounce. Otherwise, you don't know that you're sending it back to the right place because all you have is the assertion of whoever gave it to you that that's where it really came from. That then eliminates the need to do grey listing, which is a whole nother wart on email, because then the email gets delayed for an arbitrary amount of time that's not in the control of the receiving system anymore. You say, come back later, and you don't know when later will be. So that creates a worse experience for users of email generally. If we can solve that, that's another great benefit here. The whole section of being able to determine which site is responsible for which parts of a modified message is really valuable. That's what ARC doesn't give you. ARC just says it was modified from the original sender. Something got changed, no idea which bits, no idea what it used to look like. And that's one of the big holes in ARC. So if we can solve that, then that goes away and you can more reasonably trust that a mailing list manager actually only made the modification of adding a signature at the end. It didn't put a completely new message in place. So that makes mailing lists safer in a bunch of ways. And then the ability to ask for feedback. At the moment, the reason why there are 100 DKIM signatures on some messages that are received by systems is because everyone who sees it wants to get a feedback loop on it, and so they throw their own DKIM signature on, having a clearer way of doing that. Jim, did you want to?
Sorry, I was going to let you finish the slide first, but you've got a lot of goals here that I don't see in the charter. Do we need to change the charter? Or, I mean, things like crypto agility and post-quantum, I don't think are in the charter at all, right?
No.
Crypto agility
And post-quantum.
Post-quantums. This is all in the crypto agility area. That one, as my slide on it says, we're going to have to deal with it at some stage. It might be worth rolling into this. It's not a key requirement. All the others are in the points in the charter. They've just been broken out a little more into kind of sub-motivations for what the points in the charter say, I believe. All right. Eliminating replay. This is definitely in the charter. There was a lack of clarity of admission that there's a problem on the mailing list. Plenty of people saying you haven't proved to my satisfaction that this is a real problem. I have a lot of difficulty with that in general. As the chair said, there has to be some assumption of good faith and that people who run large systems and say this is a problem might actually be seeing it. rather than where we're at. I'm really keen to nail down, yes, we agree this is a problem that needs to be solved, or we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
There's no way to tell at the moment whether you were intentionally BCC'd on a message or not. There are people who say, I've seen tens to hundreds of thousands of separate copies of a message that upon inspection was clearly to one person. There's not any of these tens or hundreds of thousands of people. We have to assume good faith and believe that this is real, or we go nowhere. There have been alternative proposals to list about adding a new header and using the existing DKIM1 signature rather than putting the to and from in the header, and there's certainly stuff to discuss there. I'll address a little bit of that later on.
Hold on, before you go too much further on that, go back one, please.
Yep.
The lack of clarity, the lack of a solid definition, it's possible that that's finally started to resolve because we have a definition of replay that survived chartering.
Yeah.
Which is further than we ever got before. So I think we might be able to.
Awesome.
say-
And to what Jim had popping up with questions, please do pop up anytime with questions. I don't require completing my slides before I talk to things. There might be some things addressed later in the slides, but it's fine to just pop in with questions when they come into your head. I'd prefer to get a clear understanding of everything with everyone, and make sure your questions are answered. All right, making DSNs safe. Likewise, backscatter is a term of art. Its existence was also questioned. There's a Wikipedia page. I'd like to cite that and say, yes, backscatter is a real thing. It is when the bounce address is falsified on a message and the bounce goes to someone who was not involved in any way, shape, or form in actually generating this message. We have to accept that's real to be able to work with things as well. I discovered backscatter over 20 years ago when I started receiving it. Went, what's this? Oh yes, this is a known thing already. Backscatter is real. We need to deal with it. There are a lot of sites that would like to be able to accept a message via SMTP, hold on to it, make a determination, and then reject it safely later. I've spoken to people who have legal requirements in their jurisdiction to, when they receive an email, either safely bounce it or safely deliver it to a place where the user can see it. They're not allowed to just drop it on the floor. Particularly for them, the ability to safely return it, meaning all they need to do on receipt is check that it's correctly signed and has a bounce address. That's going to make things a lot better for them and mean they don't grey list, which is what people do at the moment. They just get the message, look at it, go, I'm not going to make a determination yet. I'll send a temporary failure back to the sending site that then has to spool it for an arbitrary amount of time. That's awful. Likewise, for privacy preserving proxies, I put something later in the slides about this. If you get a message and then rewrite it to a secret address, you don't want any bounces generated later in the chain to go back to the original source, and then they will see that supposedly private address in the bounce message. You want it to come back through your system where you can scrape off everything that said where it had gone to and bounce as if it was yourself. At the moment, to do that really reliably, you would have to hold open the incoming SMTP connection until you had delivered it all the way to its destination. By making this asynchronous, you can then asynchronously send a bounce and pretend you just held on to it for an hour before you decided to bounce it, rather than you can hide everything that happened afterwards. And we can eliminate grey listing. This was my nice little picture of that, sending from me to private@example.com, which forwards to secret@private.net. And then the bounce comes back to that forwarder, which says there was actually a bounce by private@example.com, and there's nothing about secret@private.net in there. So that line, everything on the right side of that is a black box, and you don't know what's happening in there. I already covered that. All right. Attributable changes. I don't care about the word attributable. It seemed clearest to me about describing what happened. You could imagine looking at a message and having a little box around it saying this bit came from the original sender, and then a little box around the signature at the bottom saying this bit came from the mailing list. The way I would anticipate most spam checkers dealing with this is looking at the final message and saying this looks clean, great, nothing else. This looks bad, okay, let's unwind the most recent change, look at what's generated from that, make sure it validates. Does that look bad? No. Okay, so that's the hop that introduced the bad bit. And then marking that hop as untrustworthy and blocking future stuff that has gone through it in any way, shape, or form, and putting them in a list of untrusted sites. So the difference there is you can then wind back all the way to the original source from wrong@wrong.net. All right, which bits came from there? And you can actually see what I wrote at the start, despite all the modifications that happened afterwards, and see whether it was me that wrote the bad stuff or not. So there's lots of value there. There's plenty to talk about with the draft that was up there already, the modification algebra draft. I think that's going to be an area of discussion. There's certainly the discussion on the list about that has been, should we create something that is very simple and describes just the common mailing list modifications we expect to have, or should we do what I propose, which is something that's very easy for a receiver to unwind, but also very powerful. So senders can decide what they want to do. They can use a simple algorithm. They can use a complex algorithm. I wrote a little diffing thing in Perl that just needs both copies of the message, but creates the shortest one of these that it can. That's certainly one way to do it. Another way is to remember how long your input was, tack something on the end, and just give a copy instruction for the length of the input. That means you don't need to keep the earlier copies around, but it means we can deploy this everywhere. Every receiver will be able to parse more complex stuff that someone might generate later, and the senders can come up with better ways of creating these in the future that are still backwards compatible with the rest of the network. I think once we deploy whatever we deploy, it's going to be very hard to get every site to upgrade it afterwards. So I'd prefer to have something that's more powerful on the receiving end and that allows you to reverse pretty much any type of modification. But I expect lots of discussion on that one. All right. Way for hops to ask for feedback. I have less understanding of this area. I would defer to the people who are doing a lot more feedback loops on how best to do this. But the idea is that with it, at the moment, you publish a DKIM signature on a message. You just tack it on there with whatever the content of the message is when you see it so that it validates. And then you say, I'd like feedback on this through some out-of-band mechanism. And then you get feedback on any messages that came in with your DKIM signature, whether they're accepted or not, whether they're validated or not. Rather than that, since this system already has, I say Todd's in the queue. I'll just go to finish what I'm saying and then we'll hear from someone who actually knows what they're talking about here. That each hop could specify, I want feedback about the messages that came through me. And that way, because we have an ordered sequence of signatures, there's no additional DKIM signatures. There's just the ones that already exist for this, and feedback gets added in. Todd.
It's been a while since I've had to worry too much about it, but my common understanding of the relationship between a DKIM signature and a feedback loop was in regards to complaint feedback loops, specifically at Yahoo, where one had to make sure that their messages were DKIM signed in order to get any spam complaint data from the complaint feedback loop. That's the feedback that I'm aware of. Now, I know Mr. Brotman is trying to advance a DKIM-like signature for feedback and make that a different method to getting feedback loops. So maybe that's what people are talking about. But all I'm aware of with feedback and DKIM signatures is things like Yahoo's complaint feedback loop.
Thank you. Excuse me. The reason why this one is number 5 on the list and crypto agility is number 6 is these are things that I think we don't need to test in the first round of testing to check that all the other things work. This could be easily tacked on afterwards. And it doesn't necessarily even need to be signed so long as the rest of the signatures are clean. I mean, it probably does, because otherwise somebody could add something on afterwards that said, yeah, this site totally asked for feedback, and get them extra noise or strip it off. But I think it's certainly, it's less requiring of all the crypto protection than the bounce addresses and the destination. All right, and then of course, crypto agility. We do need to figure out a path forward for allowing more than the existing DKIM keys and some way to rotate. If we can improve that in here, good. If not, doesn't bother me so much.
So I just wanted to put in a quick pause at this point. That's all the goals and how their and motivations and how their documents, the list that their documents are looking to address. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Because we're going to switch to some of the issues that have been open on the list. And I just wanted to kind of make a pause. Everybody's good? I don't see anyone popping up remotely. Okay,
All right.
going on.
Clearly, I answered all your questions already. Fantastic. All right. Why one recipient per message? This is a big area of debate on the list. It's not absolutely necessary, but if there's multiple recipients that are going to be put in the header of the message somewhere, that means they're discoverable. As soon as somebody is BCC'd on a message, you have to make sure that that message has no other recipients in it that are not supposed to get it. So you can't include that BCC'd address in the message that goes to any of the named recipients or to any other BCC'd recipient. You can have the named recipients in all of the headers that go to everybody because they're also named somewhere else, but you absolutely can't leak it to other people or you get a privacy violation. If you're creating a single message to just everybody, it's so much easier and less complex than trying to do set intersections with Ms. Murray.
I'm familiar with the debate. I actually find it a really fascinating debate. I'm wondering how it's going to resolve. But the one thing I want to make sure we eventually deal with is that, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, 5321 says you should try to pack multiple recipients into a single connection whenever that's pragmatic. And if this is the way we want to go, I think that's fine, but we have to say something about, pay homage to that advice and explain why it doesn't work anymore, something like that.
And I think the answer is you're exactly right. It's a should, which is you must do this unless you know something the rest of us don't, and which says that the document should address why it's doing this and give the reasons behind it.
Right.
That's fine.
Goes back to one of my chair slides, which was make sure we do that stuff.
Yep.
One of the things it's not only BCC, it's also all the places where we actually forwarded to multiple recipients. For example, in IKI, you can have multiple addresses where you actually forward one, you can set up, multiple addresses, your secret address and your work address and so on. That's also the place where we don't want to leak out that there's multiple recipients there. So it's not only BCC. BCC would be very easy because BCC is always, explicitly told by when you get the mail in. But when I'm doing the forwarding, I have no idea whether those two addresses I have there, whether one of those is actually supposed to be BCC or is it okay to leak both of them?
Yeah, thank you.
Wes Herdiker, USC-ISI. I'm not a DKIM expert. I run mail servers, so forgive me if this is way wrong. If I understand this correctly, you're going to create a new connection for every recipient on a server that needs to get a copy of the message?
Not necessarily a new connection. What you will do is create a new copy of the message, and it will have different signature material on it.
Right.
So you will certainly need to create a new, as I hear from the chairs here, transaction. So you'll send each one separately, maybe pipelined through a single connection.
What I'm wondering is there somebody out there with sufficient data that will know what that bandwidth explosion will be, especially when you're talking about forwarding attachments and stuff like that? Because without that,
we have data from Yahoo that says it's approximately 0. It's very few messages have more than one recipient on them.
Okay.
The case that probably would get the most here is corporate type email, where you're sending a large Word document, PowerPoint document, whatever, to a bunch of people.
Version 14 final, yeah.
Yeah, that. And they're all getting a copy of this message. And so it would then send individual copies to each of them rather than being able to send them together. Generally, bandwidth and compute has got cheap enough at the size of email, because email has limitations anyway, that if the file's big enough, it's already going to be in some central file store and a link emailed around instead. The cost is, as my last point says compute's got a lot cheaper than when this stuff was designed 30, 40 years ago. Mailing lists already send a separate message either for unique unsubscribe links, for VERP addresses so they get bounces, all that stuff. There's not much that goes to multiple recipients, and certainly not much that goes to large numbers of multiple recipients.
I assume that this will carve out delivery by client, right? So this is really server to server SMTP only, not.
Yeah, certainly a client that
Somebody
says
still on a
to
modem,
and then a bunch of addresses. If the client itself is not DKIM signing, and generally it won't be because the SMTP submission doesn't DKIM sign, the server DKIM signs before it sends it on to the next hop, then you're not doing a DKIM2 signature. This doesn't apply. To harken back to yesterday's discussion of JS contact profiles, I see this as something similar. This is a SMTP profile. We are restricting what you can do. We're saying you can only send to one recipient, which is perfectly legal. We're not changing the underlying layers at all. We're just saying, if you're putting a DKIM2 signature on this, then it needs to have a single recipient only because of the properties of DKIM2, but it's still a perfectly legal message for all the underlying transports. And it doesn't even have to go over SMTP.
Thanks for my naive questions.
I would point out that this is an interesting 30-year-old discussion because there was a point at which Dan Bernstein complained about the line that is currently in 5321 about should, use a single mail transaction, and said, I've been doing this with Qmail and blasting out multiple connections all at once, all simultaneously. And it's always better than even, doing multiple receipt twos because of the round trip times. And so take it for what it's worth.
Mm-hmm.
Barry.
This is Barry Lima. So all that said, it seems an unfortunate timing issue that we are about to release an update to 5320 whatever that says you should group them, and this is now saying basically you must not. And I realize you're talking about a profile of, but the reality is that Yahoo is saying that's the future. And it's unfortunate that we would at the same time be putting out an update that says do this and start work on the future that says don't.
I would assert that DKIM2 messages to separate recipients are different emails, not the same email.
Sure.
And hence...
The reality is that what 5321 bis says is wrong for the future. And that future is not very far in the future. So I just think that we maybe email core rather than this group should think about what the AS should say or something like that. That's all.
Without hat on, I do think that there is a way in which what 5321 bis says is still true, because this does put a lot of caveats on when you would do that split. It's when you're doing signatures where the signatures would expose the BCCs. And so, if you could do a pure pipeline of a bunch of recipients who were all on the same server and all in the two line.
You're being picayune here.
Well,
I think the reality is that Yahoo is saying don't do that in the future, and that ought to be reflected in the applicability statements that we put out today.
Yeah, I would answer that, Pete, that I propose and will argue reasonably strongly that having the ability to put multiple to addresses in the signature is likely to over-complexify things enough that it's not worth doing, despite the efficiency gains it would have in that corporate type environment.
One of the problem I had with the Yahoo's comment of 1% is that it didn't actually specify whether it's talking about actual SMTP transactions or actual two addresses. Because I mean, as people have been pointing out, there's lots of mail clients out there or maybe MTAs out there that will always split email to separate emails. They are already doing this, which means that the statistics you get is very different compared to the one that what would actually would be optional way of, optimal way of doing things if they would have actually gathered them together. I was counting out, just making a quick prep out of my own mailbox. I have been sending like 4,000 emails in a couple of last years out, and 6% or 6 to 7% of those had multiple addresses, multiple two addresses. And I would say most of those actually had two addresses in IKI, because that's where I am most in the email. And then there's quite a lot of course, mailing list and that kind of things where we have a, actual, and this wasn't actually counting at CCs at all. I was only calculating multiple two addresses. I would say much bigger had actually some CCs to somebody else.
I guess the question at this point is how much more bandwidth, how much more compute would it use if they had been split?
Yeah, but as I said, already, I think Postfix already does that automatically. Every time you get an email in, and if you forward it to multiple addresses, it actually expands to multiple transactions for each of them.
Splitting helps a lot for delivery management as well, because SMTP doesn't really handle errors if only some of the addresses fail to deliver at the data stage. So that's another reason to split it up, is for more reliable delivery. All right. So yes, I'm sympathetic, Barry, to the idea that we should go over to email core and tell them this isn't how it's really used, fix your thing. I'm also sympathetic to email core wanting to just publish without changing everything. Either way, it's not going to change what people do. And it's, I think, not going to change what we do here.
Sure, no, I agree. And just to be clear, I'm not suggesting we changed 5321 bis. I'm suggesting we changed the AS.
All right. Feel free to take that to email core.
Wade, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Wade from Google. Just wanted to pile on to, I think, the point that Richard made for Yahoo, which is basically that most mail, in fact, when I looked at the Gmail data, over 99% of our outbound traffic is to a single recipient. So I mean, this is just joining the chorus that the trends are that the vast majority of messages are to single recipient anyways. And I don't think this thing that DKIM2, that this new proposal that we're making here is going to greatly change the existing behavior of mail flow. Despite, yes, I mean, there are going to be some cases where there are multiple recipients, but it won't, at least from a performance standpoint, change that much.
Thanks, Wade. Richard.
So was that number of, having only one address in two or CC, or having one recipient as an SMTP connection? Oh, the statistics you referred to, which one what was it?
Wade, do you know the answer to that question? Go ahead.
So, I mean, this is just purely counting at SMTP transaction time. I'm not trying to look at what's on the CC.
Okay, so it was meaning it's only one address per domain, which is actually what is counting here. If you don't split them, because I assume you don't split them before you're sending it out. So because if you split them, you wouldn't have at all of those addresses. So,
I mean, due to various policies, we do split a lot of messages. This is not saying that the messages as written by the user didn't have many recipients. Due to many different policies, we already split them already.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
Richard.
I wanted to make the further point, besides producing the data, which says that what we kind of already know by just thinking about it, which is almost every message is unique because we require people to have a unique unsubscribe. People who are not sending in bulk because they're doing marketing or whatever tend to be writing just to one person, so that the number of messages which are likely to be to more than one person is pretty low. The exception to that are the spammers, who are typically trying to send the same message, identical, because they don't care, to thousands and thousands of recipients. And one of the things that struck me was that when I looked at this data about a year ago, when we were first looking at DKIM2, I had a figure of around about one and a bit % of all email was had multiple recipients, and the figures I produced lately were way less than that. I think what has happened is that a couple of the major league spammers have changed their technology stack, and they're now sending messages which are more unique than they were a while ago. And one of the things I noted was that the messages which were to more than one person were far more likely to be classified by the machine learning systems as being spam than otherwise. So basically, the only people who are the first approximation, the only people who are sending to more than one destination in the same message and putting more than one thing on the to line, except they're not putting it on the to line, they're just putting it in the protocol, are the spammers. And I don't actually care whether or not the spammers are efficient or not.
Yeah. Of course, they'll probably all be using AI to generate individual messages to people within a year or so anyway, so they will even stop doing this. All right, so I think the one area that maybe has more discussion to have is the corporate email case with the attachment CC'd to lots of people. I don't think it's worth the additional protocol complexity to support that case. I could imagine that someone from one of those areas might care. They don't tend to show up here, so maybe we can just ignore them, but I don't think we should. I do think, though, that we should test first the single to address case and get that solid, and then see if someone shows up and makes a compelling case for the alternative of why it's worthwhile. Again, as I said, compute's cheap, bandwidth's cheap compared to the size of emails these days. I don't think it's really a problem. All right, why adding the SMTP envelope to the signature? It can be in a separate header. I don't really care about that. It's been discussed on the mailing list. Either way, the recipient has to be per hop, because otherwise forwarding is indistinguishable from a replay. That's what we just covered. The sender must be per hop, because otherwise you don't have the bounce always going back exactly the same path as the original delivery. And if you don't have that, then the privacy preserving forwarders aren't possible. I think having privacy preserving forwarders be solid is a worthwhile goal for this, given that it falls out of the rest of this, and that's actually a really useful privacy thing.
Hi, Jim Fenton again. The case that I'm concerned about is actually whether forwarding is indistinguishable from mailing lists. One of the, in my limited experience, some of the replays that I've received seem to be cases where they send the message to maybe a mailing list that I haven't subscribed to, and they just create a huge mailing list, perhaps on one of the large email domains, and then they send a message to it, and then the mailing list goes away afterwards. And so, yeah, I guess I'm concerned as to whether this is a complete solution to the problem, because if I've got something that's a mailing list or something that's just posing as a mailing list, then it satisfies all of these properties, because they can re-sign the message and send it out one recipient per message and so forth. But I just don't see this as being effective against that mode of attack.
It is. It's effective because unless if you're on the mailing list, then obviously you'll get messages from the mailing list. But if you're not on the mailing list, then the mailing list server will not sign a message that has your particular to address in the to line. And hence, if you receive a copy of that message, you will know it wasn't originally for you. And so you can reject it.
Sure, but that requires the mail system to know what mailing lists I'm subscribed to, which it doesn't currently.
Yeah, that is a completely separate issue. I don't think there's any way we could solve that in this protocol. If you are subscribed to the mailing list, if the sending system believes you're subscribed to the mailing list, it will send you a message. And short of having it, if they can sign up to a mailing list system that doesn't opt you in correctly, then they can sign up to the mailing list. And that mailing list system you can report as being the source of the problem.
I've gotten those from very big domains that I'm sure would completely ignore my report.
That there is some separate work, and that's not in scope for this, but there is work happening at the moment on consent stored at the receiving end. So rather than having mailing lists track that you've consented to have your email address added to it, they get a token from the recipient that says, here's a token you can use to deliver to this recipient, and if you don't have this token, then you're going to be assumed to not have their consent.
I agree. I'm not sure that this is particularly a solvable problem, but I think it's something that should probably be noted in security considerations as a potential hole, because it is. And I'm referring both to actual mailing lists and things that are pretending to be mailing lists that aren't opting me in.
I think what we have to say about this is all this protocol does is allows you to tell that a signing domain intended to send a message to you or intended to send a message to the next address that it sent the message to. And so you can't replay to anyone that signing domain didn't intend, as if the signing domain did intend. If it comes from a domain that intended to send you that message, then all bets are off. That's totally outside the scope of this.
Richard, go ahead.
What we do have in the protocol is that if you have what I shall call exploded the message, i.e. you received one copy and you're now going to send it to N people, you have to actually mark the fact that you have exploded it as one of the as part of your signature, so that the person anybody who receives it is not surprised to receive multiple copies. If you are not prepared to admit that you have exploded it, then if the receiver sees multiple copies, they may well take a local policy decision that the later copies are replay, and they will reject them. And the other thing is that we did put in a provision such that the original sender could put a flag on the message saying this message is not to be exploded. Again, if somebody does explode it, then a receiver can tell that the original sender's request has been ignored. And it might be suitable for the sort of people who are currently being widely exploited by replay, for those people to if they were using DKIM2, they might feel that at least for a while they were going to put a do not explode onto their messages in order to be able to clamp down on the abuse of their platforms.
Yeah, I just note that some of those mechanisms, I think, are available to large domains and not to small ones, recipient domains.
It is certainly the case that if you're running a mail server and you're the only person there, you can't actually tell whether or not something is being replayed, because you will only ever see the one copy that comes to you. Equally, you're still in the position that you can have a look and see who has been handling the message and whether or not they claim to have exploded it. Because if they are exploding it, they need to record that for the benefit of the other people who are getting the message, who are at the large mailbox providers.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Why DKIM2 rather than extending the existing DKIM signature? We need to have a signature per hop in order for this to work, because each hop is saying, I'm sending it on to this specific next address. Any hop could be an exploiter, whether it is an alias with multiple recipients, a mailing list, or some other thing that creates multiple outbound messages. And so it needs to separate it into 1, 2 each of these targets. They need to be ordered, so you need to know what order these were supposed to go in, particularly because a message could theoretically loop through the same address, maybe with a different subject or some other header that makes it be handled differently. Ideally, not just an infinite mail loop, but you would detect that with this as well. And because of that, we also need to interoperate with existing systems. So if we just put this in a DKIM signature header with some extra fields, there would be a ton of signatures that didn't validate, most particularly the signature of the original source that aligned with the from address would not validate as soon as any changes were made. This would, if we were using the same header and trying to interoperate with existing systems, I believe would create exactly the thing that the chairs were talking about right at the start, which is damage to existing systems. We also want to experiment, and I put a little aside here, do we even want to pick a header name that is not going to persist forever for our early experiments? So everyone who implements draft N has to update to the final release, or they will just disappear out of the ecosystem rather than existing as a slightly inoperable version. Jim.
I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing from me by now.
What do you mean by now? Been tired of hearing from you for years.
Sure. So signature per hop, I mean, DKIM, existing DKIM accommodates multiple signatures just fine. There was something I didn't follow about loops and so forth, but we can talk about that. I like the idea of having an ordering tag in the signature, but existing DKIM, at least assuming the verifiers are written according to the spec, should be ignoring tag value fields that they don't understand. So as long as we pick something new for that tag, then it shouldn't confuse existing DKIM. And so I guess I don't see the problem with.
All right. The yes but here is, suppose I send a message and it has my DKIM signature on it correctly, and then it goes to a mailing list which modifies the message and sends it on. My DKIM signature is now broken. And so when it reaches the end system with another DKIM signature on there that's not aligned, it's going to say this message was modified in transit, and the receiving system, if it's not DKIM2 aware, is going to treat that message as broken and incorrectly signed rather than correctly signed with fields it doesn't understand. Because it's not backwards compatible in that case, I think using the DKIM signature would be actively worse and would damage some mail flows pretty badly.
So I think you're referring to, you used the word aligned, and DKIM doesn't have a notion of alignment. So you're talking about really a compatibility with DMARC, I think.
Potentially, yes. I mean, but also there's going to be a ton of DKIM signatures that just don't validate on messages.
Sure. Well, there are now.
Yeah.
So yeah, in any case, so I maybe that's the thing that we need to work is the sort of the DMARC angle on it, since you were concerned about the validity of the aligned signature. Also, experimental header names, we've got kind of a mixed, I don't remember all of the history, maybe
Twice in brackets.
maybe the chairs do, but you know, there was this whole like X- header field name thing that I think has been kind of deprecated because they never die.
Mm-hmm.
Hence my appearance in the queue here. Hat thrown off. Yeah, experimental header names turn out to be really bad ideas 99.99999% of the And the problem is they don't go away. And so you end up not being able to cut over, but have two things out in the wild, and people won't switch to them. And if the experimental one works reasonably well, you end up having to put both of them on. And so with the possibility, my recommendation is always you start with what you think you're going to end up with. And people who implement early may have to adjust to the fact that somehow it changed in development in particular subtle ways. And if it gets really bad, pick another one. But don't go in on the assumption that it's an experimental header. Go in on the assumption that it's final and give up if you need to, and choose something else if the first time it was terribly broken.
Pete, no, never mind. This is Barry Leva. Yes, if you're talking about, yes to Pete, if you're talking about things like calling this DKIM2 temp or something, maybe. There's actually quite a history of using this kind of thing as an ongoing development tool, where you call it something like DKIM2XYZ57-01, and then you have a -02 or something, where it is sufficiently obvious that this isn't the final version, and then nobody supports that. And when you're finished, you call it DKIM2. That has a history of working, and other protocols have used that successfully to identify which development version you're talking these days.
Can you give me an example in email where that's worked?
I don't know about email. I mean, there was some.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. In other contexts, this has worked.
Well, and again, I think if we do this with a sufficiently awkward name, I think it can work here too. The issue is that we've always tried to use something like X nice name, and that has failed. And I agree that that's just a bad idea.
All right, I am happy with either. I don't particularly mind in this case. All right. Why a powerful body modification algorithm? I covered this a little bit right at the start. It needs to be very easy for the validator to parse. So you need to not have anything complex for the validator to have to deal with. It needs to anticipate future needs, because once this thing is shipped, it's going to be very hard to put breaking changes across the whole system. I had a question here. Do we need to limit the number of instructions in the DKIM delta body and number of headers in DKIM delta header? At the moment, it allows you to list all the headers that are going to be added or removed to get back to the previous version. There is, I guess, a limit on that in some ways. You have to add a header in order to put it there to be removed, but it might be sensible to put some kind of reasonable but high limit on there, like 100. And likewise, the DKIM delta body, for that, we definitely, I think, need to restrict the number of items you can use. I don't have a slide that shows the format of this, but DKIM delta body is basically a set of copy instructions that says copy this range of octets from the source message to make the destination message. In this case, source is the later message, and you're trying to recreate an earlier message. What we don't want is the ability to explode indefinitely by copying the whole message n times and overflowing a validator. So I think there is some reasonable limit you could put in place there. Murray.
Does this play nicely with canonicalization? Because it seems like if you just specify a range, you have to specify whether that's before or after relaxed and all that kind of stuff. Or you actually, DKIM2, I think, took some of that away, right? You have only one canonicalization now for the body.
That's a discussion point later. I would prefer to only have one canonicalization for the body, which is end of line alignment. I think you have to do that because email systems don't preserve line endings reliably. But other than that, but yes, once you're in octet territory, you need to be exact.
The other thing that strikes me is that back when we did the original, separate from canonicalization, but back when we did that, we were very worried about weird mutations that MTAs we don't know about might make, which could invalidate this. Like if you move everything by 1 byte, your calculus stops working. And so this sounds like it's relying quite a bit on all that having stopped.
Yeah, it is. Also, those intermediate MTAs are validating and signing. So if they're doing weird shit in between, then they're going to have to figure out how to describe what they did, or they won't be able to validate and sign. So that's tough. All right, open questions. Can we upgrade from DKIM somehow? And what I specifically mean here is that a message was sent by a DKIM-aware sender that signed the message and said, this has come from me. Here's my hopefully aligned DKIM signature. Can the next hop that is DKIM2 aware take that message and say, it came to me with this signature on it. I'm adding DKIM2 stuff from now. When you unwind back to check whether it arrived to me and I didn't modify it, or I described my modifications, you can then validate that original DKIM1 signature and tell that it came to me correct. There's some conditions on this. That DKIM signature needs to cover the fields that are really important, to, from, all that kind of thing. Otherwise, the next hop could modify them secretly. But otherwise, I think that there may be something there. There has been some debate on the pros and cons of this. Pro of it is more of the world would just interoperate. You only have to upgrade forwarders, and the rest, forwarders, mailing lists, etc. The rest kind of falls out already. The big con is that it discourages people from upgrading to DKIM2. So there's an open question there. The question of what modifications we should support harkens back to my previous slide about how powerful should we make the algebra. I would argue very, but maybe the receiving systems can put limitations as a matter of policy, that if the modification looks too complex, they can say, yeah, you're probably doing something weird, go jump. And that would be easier to change over time as new modification ideas came through. Which headers should be mandatory for signing? Richard has promised a list of those. Hopefully he'll have that soon, based on best practice, etc. These are the kind of things we need to not necessarily lock down for early testing, but lock down fairly early because they affect interop. The idea in the proposal for DKIM2 at the moment is that in existing DKIM, you list exactly which headers you're signing. And you also list, if there's more than one copy of the same header, you have to list each one. So you wind up in a situation called oversigning, where each header that is specified by the underlying protocol to only be a singleton is listed twice to guarantee that someone doesn't add another one and break things. I would prefer it to be that for any named header, every single copy of it is in the signature, so that adding another one always breaks. And also we've talked about having the mandatory set already locked in so that you only list additional headers that are being signed rather than all of them. I put some discussion text in one of those documents about this, saying that once a header has been signed by any hop, all future hops also have to include that in their signature, because otherwise things get a bit weird. Relaxed or something stricter? That was the question from Murray there. Can we be strict on the body and require it to be an exact set of octets? Can we rely on that transiting through systems or not? That may need some testing. We'd certainly prefer it for a bunch of reasons, including less CPU time used on verifiers. And then there's the handling upgrade, and this is a whole big open question that I think will require quite a lot of discussion. My original proposal a year something ago, which I don't know if it made it even to an IETF draft before, that I was throwing around to a few people, suggested that you would check at SMTP layer or with a DNS query whether the next hop supported DKIM2. And if you did not know that it had asserted it would support DKIM2, you would sign something in your signature that you added to the message saying, I know that this message is exiting the DKIM2 ecosystem after me. So it might get replayed, it might get whatever. I accept this is going to happen to me. The downside of that is that you need to do that detection, and there's some real difficulties at implementation level here, particularly if you're detecting it in the SMTP transaction. You either do the signing on the fly based on this, and so you do it while the connection's open, or you create 2 copies of the message, or at least 2 copies of the signature, and then pick which one you're going to send based on what happens next, what happens during the transaction. With DNS, it's a little easier, but it does mean an additional DNS lookup every time. And it also means that there's more possibility for misconfiguration where you are either missing the DNS record or you have a DNS record, but your system doesn't actually support DKIM2, and then you're in trouble because you can't do anything with the message other than bounce it. And you don't know how to do that because the system that it's going back to will say, well, I expected this to go to a DKIM2 system and I'm getting back a bounce that's not DKIM2 styled. All right.
John,
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. John Levine, I agree there are many worms in this can. Although this suggests to me, actually, this is a strong reason why we should call this something other than, call this EKIM rather than DKIM. Because, yeah, my guess is in practice, most of the time you'll know whether the recipient system handles DKIM2 or not, because you'll have talked to them before and you'll have some idea and you'll look something up. But if you're not sure, you put both signatures on, and then either on the next hop, if they do DKIM2, then they'll do another DKIM2 signature and chain that, or else they won't. I mean, there's no solution here which is perfect, but I think some sort of double signing like that probably would work, and we could do it, and doesn't require having candidate copies of messages that you throw away if the recipient doesn't agree that they like it.
Yeah, I think the lightest weight version of this is to have a tag which says may exit DKIM2 at the next hop that just gets added by everything to start off with, and then as you start to know that the next hop does support DKIM2, you can then take that off and say no, must not exit DKIM2 at the next hop, and then you just bounce it if the next hop no longer supports DKIM2.
Yeah.
I do see some value in over time saying no, this has got to stay in DKIM2.
Yeah, you're probably right. I think this is once we've done some experiments, I think we'll understand this a lot better.
This is reminding me that this is yet another way that we are reaching across the boundary from message up into the way messages are handled. It's not just the content anymore. I understand the reasons that we're doing it, but I feel like this is something we're going to have to include a fair bit of prose about to, make the community happy that we're doing such weird things here. But, sure.
So if you actually cache that information that the other end supports DKIM2 and then they stopped using it because they found out that it doesn't work or something like that, they have issues, that actually can create very bad situations where you are, it's now exiting DKIM2 and there is no way of me as an operator, because my DKIM2 system broke completely, I need to shut it down. How do I tell everybody that please reset the flag that I'm doing DKIM2 now? So that's why I think having it in DNS or in SMT extension is the only real way to actually do it. I don't think we can actually cache that information that well. We can use that cached information for hints to say that, okay, if we sign it this way and in the SMTP extension isn't there, okay, now we need to say, hold a moment, I need to go back and resign this or to do something.
Yeah, I think we should certainly try and learn some things from communities like DNSSEC and certificate pinning, that kind of thing that deals with this same issue of the remote site did do this, but for some reason it has stopped. But I do see some value also in having some kind of tagging that says this really shouldn't be going outside DKIM2. So if you see it as if it has gone outside DKIM2, then something odd's probably happening.
Richard?
I wanted to address the headers business because it's something I've been very keen on all the way through. Is that we should not leave it random as to which headers get signed. I think after the number of years we've had, we ought as a community to have a pretty good idea which headers should be signed. And in particular, I see people noting that headers are getting signed, like some of the list headers, the mailing list headers, and this causes difficulty when mail goes from one mailing list into another mailing list because they want to replace the list headers and put in other ones, and the signatures which are there cause this to be harder than it might be otherwise, and also people do sign things which just don't make any sense and don't have any security properties. But worse, they don't sign things which do have security properties because they haven't realized what damage could be done by somebody who is being clever and then effectively forging an email which would appear to be signed. And therefore, it seemed to me that since we ought to be able to produce a consensus as to what a correct list of things to be signed was, then we should put that in. It's going to be quite a long list because there are quite a lot of headers in the in RFCs scattered around. So we should agree perhaps some ground rule that says if it's not in an RFC, then it doesn't make it into the list. But most of the things which in RFCs should be there. And most people would not want to put that entire list in there because some of the headers are so exotic that that it comes as a surprise even to email experts that these headers even exist and are described. So that was the reason for doing that. Obviously, we have to have an extension mechanism which makes it easy to say and add in this special header which is proprietary to me and means something and has a security property and must continue to appear. Equally, that should be rare because if it has a security property to you, does it actually have a security property to the next hop? Because that's the next hop is the only person who's going to care whether or not it got changed or not. So that was the reason for doing the header stuff. As the other thing I want to just say quickly about possibly fragmenting the conversation is this business of relaxed. We did look at this and something like 95% of all email is relaxed at the moment. This appears to be because the large providers who produce most of the mail which we were measuring have decided on relaxed because they are extremely cautious and think that it is clear that what happens to headers in all sorts of systems means that doing anything other than relaxed on headers is extremely
fragile.
It's fragile if you don't do that, so relaxed for headers is correct. However, if we are all going to be reading bodies into memory in order to do the algebra, in order to do the undo modifications and so forth, then since the body is sitting there in memory it is a great deal faster and cheaper and heats up the planet less if we then do a strict and just push the whole thing as a big buffer into the hashing algorithm, rather than having to pre-process it, split it up into lines and do all of the tidying up in order to canonicalize it. So I think we need to do some measurements. We need to look at the amount of code which is involved, but I would not wish to do what DKIM 1 has done and make it optional. I think having two sets of code for dealing with this is we must have learned something from the last few years. So let's learn those lessons and then simplify the code.
Yeah, I would, looking at senders using relaxed, I would say there is absolutely no incentive as a sender to use strict. All it's going to do is reduce your deliverability with no upside. And so the push for strict has to come from the receiver end. And I agree that we should try and make strict be the one and only standard for bodies, not for headers, but for bodies, saying body must be strict. You can't fiddle, particularly because otherwise the algebra becomes a lot more complex. You have to start calculating in terms of lines. Yeah.
Wei, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a bit about this upgrade or interop between DKIM 1 and DKIM 2 world. I think there is also an opportunity in DKIM 2, if you will, being able to better support DKIM 1. So like, for example, let's say we have this capability to do these reverse transformations to help support mailing lists. Could this not also help DKIM 1? And so yes, maybe that message that's partially has some set of headers with DKIM 2. Maybe we don't call that as being DKIM 2 authenticated, but perhaps it could be viewed as being DKIM 1 authenticated. And then that's actually something that hopefully we can go see when we do our initial testing. And then that would also help, potentially solve some of these mailing list issues and all of that at an earlier state, than rather than wait for the entire ecosystem to become DKIM 2. So the other point I would like to make is also towards the bottom of this slide is basically around, how do we tell if something is going to be compatible with DKIM 2 as a sender, right? I mean, so the one thing I guess, and I think Braun's document calls this out, that's it's not only that the receiver has to support DKIM 2, but that they also have the right keys to do these things. There is this notion of alignment across at the receiving side. So like, for example, in some hosted sort of setup, right? The hosting provider may have the capability to do, this DKIM 2, but then maybe the domain that they are hosting does not have the keys. And then that could be a problem, and that has to be somehow communicated. So basically, I'm just pointing out there needs to be a great deal of care there. I think it's very important to do that capability mechanism. It just, to add on to all the other concerns that were laid out by others before me, I think that's a very important part of this design, and it's one of the things that should be tackled very early on.
Yeah, and particularly something would need to be added. You can't just do a lookup to see whether a key exists in the destination domain, because they will have a selector on them as well. And you can't tell which selector is going to be used. So you can't just see, is there a key in DNS? It must support DKIM 2. There would need to be some affirmative additional thing added. All right, thanks, Wei. I think at this stage, the only slide I have to talk about here is that next steps. I think we will want to lock down the headers and the format for trial, lock down what's in the modification algebra, lock down what's in which headers are required to be signed, and then we could start doing interoperability testing on this. The other thing I didn't mention in this slide, and sorry, Alan, for getting this, but this is your part of things, is the bounce handling, the format of the bounce messages. So when you send back a delivery status notification, it needs to include sufficient information to verify that the message came through that earlier hop, ideally without needing to include the entire contents of the message. But you also want to be able to validate that, yes, this is a signature I created, and it referenced a message that came through me, and then that allows the bounce handling to go all the way back. What I have said in the motivation draft for this is that a system that participates in DKIM 2 will be required to hold the key that it used for signing so that it can sign bounce messages as well for a period that is to be defined, but I think should probably be a week. We can debate on whether it should be 2 weeks or a day or whatever. But if you send a message, you are taking responsibility for dealing with any message that comes back, any delivery status notification that comes back for that message for a period, a fixed period of time, after which you can just say this is expired. It no longer has a right to transit back through me. We definitely want to get some implementations to interoperability testing. I would like to lock down consensus on some of the components of the design space so that we limit how far we're exploring, because we can't test everything. But yeah, certainly nothing's off the table at this stage. If people have proposals for ways to change things, I'm very happy to hear them. I'm sure my other co-authors are as well. So long as they give the properties that we say we need.
All right. Any more questions on what Bron's got? As Murray and I were chatting, is there anyone in the room who thinks that a call for adoption on the list is way too premature and there's more discussion that needs to be going on? Well, and that's part of the question is, are any of the documents, no, let's not even call for adoption yet because I think there's a crap load more discussion that needs to go on? Or should we do the call and someone can say on the list? We're just getting a sense in the room. Do you think that there is some objection to a call for adoption on the list that we could deal with here in the room, or we're going to have to discuss on the list anyway? So just put out the call and see who has objections.
This is Barry Lieba. I would say the latter, the last. I'll remind everybody that adopting documents doesn't mean their content is right. It just means that they are addressing an issue that we're going to write a document about, and they're a reasonable starting point. And I think we have that. So I would support adopting everything and saying nothing's off the table for changing.
I will not speak for my co-chair. I tend to be along Barry's lines that, adopt anything that has the ID template is fine with me. And there are people who won't adopt until it is 2 drafts short of a proposed standard. Careful, Jim. But I guess if there are open questions beyond the content of what Bron just said and are about really this one should be held in abeyance for a while, could you please explain why we should adopt this? We'd like to hear them since we have still 15 minutes left.
One more thing before Jim. Even if we adopt, let's say, the bottom one on the list is the algebra one, even if we adopt it and don't like it, we can always abandon it and go to something else. So this is just, do we want to begin churning on these documents? Jim.
Yeah, Jim Fenton. I think it's also important to ask the original authors when they want it to be adopted, because when it's adopted, then they are ceding editorial control. They're ceding change controls of the working group, and that makes things a little more awkward. They can't just edit the document willy-nilly. So they should, we should ask them when they want to do that as well.
And my impression, and Bron can correct me if I'm wrong, is any old time is right.
Yeah, I'm one of the authors. The other 2 are both online. Either of them are welcome to pop in and say, I'd like to hold it a bit longer. Otherwise, I'm happy for adoption.
But I'm at least not seeing anyone in the room getting up going, wait, I need a couple of questions answered in real time before we start having that discussion on the list. So that's good. Anything else on Bron's stuff? Easy peasy.
All right.
All right.
Thank you. I'm going to go sit down.
Oh, we have to unshare. Here we are.
Do we have anything else that we want to talk about, including would we like to do an interim meeting, or do we want to wait for Madrid? What do people feel like in terms of momentum and eagerness to get things going here? Barry? Oh, very much.
I should have just stayed up at the mic. I think it's definitely worth doing an interim meeting or two before Madrid. Once we lock down those couple of things we need to do to start doing interop, I'd like to get started on interop. I am moving to the United States of America in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks' time. And of all the standards work, this is my primary focus. So I'm certainly going to be putting a lot of time into this. I think there are others who are as well. It's worth having some interim meetings so that we can touch base with the IETF community rather than working entirely separate as we do that interop testing.
Okay.
This is Barry. I agree with that in principle, but I think it's too early to decide when those are going to be at this point. So while I expect that we will have interim meetings, I don't think we should plan them yet.
That's fine. Everybody else is indifferent. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, sorry, Wei.
Go ahead, Wei.
Wei.
Yeah, maybe this is a question for the chairs. Basically, I was wondering if we were to do interim meetings, how frequent would the chairs be willing to do them? As I'm sure there will be lots of work and lots of discussions. Having input would be great.
Right, Murray joked, how much money do you
Oops,
have? I'm not inclined, well, I'm not inclined to weekly calls, thanks. At least unless and until there's some wild amount of work that is going on that we really need such things. And hopefully that will be a burst of activity and not sustained. But, if we want to do, 1, 2, 3, 4 between now and Madrid, let's start the discussion on the list. I mean, Bron just held up 2 fingers. Let's start the discussion on the list and see when people start feeling like, yeah, we're making enough progress that we think having an interim and hashing out some difficult issues is worth it. So I would expect 2 or 3 is a reasonable number.
Can I suggest as a first one, we target the second half of April? I saw one nod. I see nobody swearing at me or anything, so let's try to set that up.
Any other business? You have 13 minutes left if you want to use them, or you can sneak out and get an early lunch. Going once? Oh, Barry.
This is Barry. I think we should debate whether Bron's doing the right thing by moving to the United States. No.
Yeah. Yes. Extension of plenary into the working group meetings. Barry and Bron are moving to the same neighborhood. All right, going once, going twice. Thank you all. See you on the list. And thank you, Richard, for showing up at this meeting at the ridiculous hour that it is there. And thank you for not turning on your camera and showing us your pajamas.
You're very welcome, Pete. It's 4:20 in the morning.
Either go take a nap or go get some coffee, but either way, off with you. Thanks.